I'm Erica Quinn, 51, and I spent 3 decades earning authority in a Navy that rarely made room for women like me. For years, I gave my loyalty, my work, and my silence to people who benefited from it. But when an old colleague erased my name from an official visit package and let another man treat me like I didn't belong, I made a choice that changed everything. Have you ever been underestimated, betrayed, or humiliated by someone you once trusted? Tell me your story in the comments. You're not alone. Before I get into what happened, let me know where you're watching from. And if you've ever had to stand up for yourself after being wronged, hit like and subscribe for more true stories about boundaries, dignity, and taking your power back. What happened next might surprise you. My father wore his khakis like armor. I didn't understand that then. I thought it was pride, and it was, but not in the way a 9-year-old imagines. It was the pride of someone who had decided, once and completely, where they belonged. I wanted that certainty more than I wanted anything else he could have given me. It was 1983. I was 9 years old, standing in the doorway of our brick row house 2 blocks from the Annapolis waterfront, watching Senior Chief Petty Officer Raymond Quinn come home. He was 33 years old, still lean in the way career Navy men stay lean, not from vanity but from discipline, from years of early mornings and physical standards, and the metabolism of someone who has never allowed himself to be soft about anything he cared about. He set his cover on the peg by the door. He did it the same way every time, not a ceremony, not a gesture, just a habit so settled it had become invisible to him. He sat at the kitchen table without turning on the light. He didn't say much. He never did, not right away, not after a long day or a long deployment stretch. He needed a few minutes to cross back over the threshold from the Navy to the rest of his life, and I had learned, by 9, to watch him do it quietly from the doorway. I asked him what the anchors meant, the rank insignia on his collar, the way the metal caught the afternoon light coming through the kitchen window. He looked at me for a moment before he answered, the way adults do when a child has asked something real without knowing it. "They mean I stayed," he said. I didn't fully understand the answer. I kept it anyway. The way you keep something you know you'll need later, even if you don't yet know what for. Raymond Quinn enlisted in the United States Navy in 1968 at 18 years old, out of Annapolis, Maryland, with nothing specific ahead of him except the decision itself. He retired in 1992 as a Senior Chief Petty Officer, E8, 24 years, clean and complete. He never pushed me toward the service. He never had to. The push was in the way he carried himself through every ordinary room, the quiet authority of a man who had spent 2.5 decades deciding every morning that the thing he'd chosen was still worth choosing, and finding, every morning, that it was. I grew up understanding without being told that belonging to something larger than yourself was not a sacrifice. It was a form of precision. You had to know exactly what you were before you could give it completely. My father knew exactly what he was. I spent the next 30 years of my life working to know that about myself with the same certainty, in a system that offered me far fewer maps. I entered the United States Naval Academy in 1992 at 17 years old, part of a small percentage of women in my class. Bancroft Hall, with 8 miles of corridors and 4,000 midshipmen, was not designed with my presence in its blueprint. None of the corridors were. None of the syllabi, the drill formations, the intelligence track coursework, the mess hall hierarchies that sorted themselves out in the first week, regardless of what any regulation said. The academy teaches you many things. One of the most important things it teaches you, not in any classroom, but in every hallway and every mess and every drill, is how to be the only one. How to carry your authority in a room that wasn't built with you in its dimensions. How to make your precision visible enough to be undeniable without making your effort visible enough to be used against you. I learned this over 4 years, not in a single lesson, but in hundreds of small ones, each one requiring a calibration I never let anyone see me make. I graduated in 1996, knowing that particular skill better than any other I had acquired. My father was in the stands on commissioning day. He didn't make a scene. He was never a man who made scenes. He wore his retired senior chief uniform for the first time in 4 years, pressed so sharply the creases could have drawn blood, and when I walked across the stage, he nodded. Once. That was enough. That was everything. My first fleet billet was at the Naval Special Warfare Command Intelligence Directorate at Little Creek, Virginia. I reported in 1997, 22 years old, carrying the weight of 4 years at the academy, and a determination to prove that my presence there was not an experiment or an accommodation. The directorate was a practical, underlit space that smelled like coffee and recycled air and the particular tension of offices where consequential decisions are made without ceremony. I was the most junior person in the room by grade and one of 2 women in the entire section. The officer who showed me the filing systems, the team radio nets, the informal shorthand the operators used in the field was Lieutenant Marcus Del Rey, 03, age 25. SEAL support officer assigned to the section. He was easy-natured and sharp, with the particular charm that functions equally well in briefing rooms and at command social functions, and in the narrow practical spaces between operations. He read my first target package assessment without comment, then looked up from the printout and said, "That's a clean package, Quinn. Most junior analysts hedge everything until the product is useless. You didn't. That's either confidence or instinct. Either way, don't lose it." He said it in front of the section chief. I was 22. I let that be enough. There was a version of those early years where I would tell you Marcus and I were partners, equal contributors, mutual advocates. I believed that version for a long time. The data never quite supported it, but I wasn't in the habit of running analysis on the people I trusted. What I tracked was the work, and the work was good, and it was getting better, and we were both rising through the intelligence pipeline of an organization that ran on precision and discretion and the willingness to do hard things quietly and without expectation of credit. Over the years that followed, we built parallel careers in the NSDUG2 intelligence pipeline. I taught him the nuances of multi-source target packages, the kind of product that SEAL team leaders actually trusted, the kind that committed to a conclusion and documented the logic so cleanly that the conclusion was either right or correctable and never hidden behind qualification. He brokered my access to team leadership, introduced me to senior enlisted, vouched for me in pre-mission huddles where a junior officer who hadn't yet accumulated her own track record needed someone to open the door. It felt like a fair exchange, as it felt like 2 professionals building something together. What I didn't track closely enough was the asymmetry. I was teaching him the work, and he was teaching me the access, and access is portable in ways that craft is not. Craft travels with you wherever you go. Access requires the person who granted it to keep granting it. I was also producing twice the volume of analytical product he was. Both of us knew it. Only one of us accounted for it. By 2001, I was a lieutenant, 03, and Del Rey had been promoted to lieutenant commander, ahead of me by 1 grade and 1 promotion cycle. In 2003, I deployed as intelligence officer, attached to SEAL Team 2, managing the target package cycle for kinetic operations during the pre-surge period in Iraq. It was the most demanding work of my career to that point. Real stakes, real timelines, real consequences for the people depending on getting it right, and real consequences when it wasn't. I carried those teams in my head, their personnel files, their behavioral patterns under pressure, the specific gaps in their situational awareness that my intelligence product was built to fill. I knew them better than they knew themselves in certain circumstances, and they knew it, and they trusted it, and that trust was the contract I honored completely and without exception or excuse. Del Rey was stateside. He called regularly at first, then weekly, staying current on the operational intelligence picture through me. I shared freely because I trusted him, and because I believed we were building shared understanding of the theater together. I returned in 2005. He met me at the airport with coffee. He looked at me the way you look at someone who has come back different, and he said, "You sound settled, Erica, like you finally know exactly what you are." He meant it as a compliment. I took it as one. I didn't notice until much later that he had told me I sounded settled in the same tone people use when they mean, "You've stopped being threatening." Both things were probably true. The operational experience that had made me more certain of myself had also, apparently, made me less legible as a rival. That was useful information. I just hadn't assembled it into that shape yet. My father was 75 then, sitting in Annapolis with a framed photograph of my ensign commissioning on the wall behind him, and, 1 frame over, a newer photograph with 2 stars on my collar. He had told me I would get there. He had never said it in those words. He had said it by staying. I returned from my second Iraq tour in 2008, a different kind of officer, harder at the edges, cleaner in my decisions, certain in a way that only operational experience can produce. I was 33 years old and a lieutenant commander assigned to the NSWC headquarters intelligence staff at Coronado. It was a headquarters position that placed me in the analytical chain above the team-level billet I had occupied for years. The work was demanding, and I was ready for it. What I was slower to see was that someone else had been watching my trajectory with the particular attention of a person who calculates proximity to rising things. Del Rey was there, commander by then, 05, assigned to a parallel staff role. He had, during my second deployment, published a paper through the Naval War College on intelligence methodology in counterterrorism support operations. The paper cited collaborative analytical work within the directorate in a footnote. It did not name me. The methodology it described, a multi-source target assessment framework built on a tiered validation approach that I had developed and refined across 2 combat deployments, was mine. I recognized my own thinking the way you recognize your own handwriting, even cleaned up in someone else's typography and submitted under someone else's byline. I made a choice in 2008 that I would make differently now. I found my work in someone else's publication, and I convinced myself it was shared material, the natural result of years of collaborative work in a shared environment where ideas moved freely between people. Institutional amnesia, I told myself, common in collaborative environments. I was generous with that explanation. I was always generous with that explanation. I marked the paragraph with a pencil, closed the paper, and didn't raise it with him. It was the first time I chose quiet resolution over a clear accounting. It would not be the last, and each time I chose it, the price I was extending to him went up slightly, and I didn't track that either. The years between 2008 and 2014 have a shape I can see clearly, now that I couldn't see from inside them. Del Rey's availability narrowed. His responses to my messages became shorter, more professional, more carefully calibrated to the minimum warmth necessary to maintain the form of the relationship without the full substance of it. He offered congratulations at the right moments in the right language with the careful warmth of someone doing arithmetic while they're talking to you. I recognized the arithmetic in retrospect. At the time, I filed it under people getting busy. It was a useful category. It meant I didn't have to reclassify what we were. In 2010, I was promoted to Commander, 05, and took a senior intelligence position on the NWC headquarters staff. The gap in rank that had existed since 2001 narrowed back to 0. And then, in 2014, it reversed. In 2014, I was selected for captain and assigned command of the Naval Special Warfare Center at Coronado, the Bud East Training Command, one of the most consequential leadership billets in naval special warfare. Del Rey was also promoted to captain the same cycle, to a staff role with less operational weight. He called to congratulate me. The call was 2 minutes long. "Good for you, Erica," he said. "Nahazalo Center is a hell of a command. You've always landed on your feet." Landed on your feet is what you say about someone who fell. I didn't correct him. I said thank you. I said we should have dinner and celebrate, and he said yes, and we never did, and I noticed that too and decided it was schedules. It was a decision I made quickly without much examination, because examining it would have required me to reclassify things I had been storing under the convenient heading of people getting busy for the better part of a decade. I wasn't ready to do that. I was still running the analysis on the wrong data set. I commanded the Naval Special Warfare Center for 2 years, 2014 through 2016. It was difficult, important, and isolating in ways I hadn't fully anticipated, not because the work exceeded my capability, but because I was the first woman to hold the command, and every room I walked into had to pause and recalibrate before it could settle into what we were there to do. I ran the command well. I updated Bud S attrition review protocols, improved the mental performance training pipeline, initiated changes to the assessment culture that the command would carry forward for years after I departed. I left it in better shape than I found it. That is what command is supposed to mean. During those 2 years, I reached out to Del Rey 4 times. He responded to 2. Both responses were brief and professionally warm and entirely devoid of anything personal. I filed that under people getting busy, the same as everything else. In 2017, I learned through a mutual colleague in a casual hallway conversation, not from Del Rey directly, not with any advance notice, not with the professional courtesy one might expect from someone who had known me for 20 years, that he had been assigned as commanding officer of the Naval Special Warfare Center at Coronado. the same billet I had vacated a year earlier. The command I had built and departed and left better than I found it. I sat with that information for a full day before calling him. When I did, he answered on the first ring and was warmer than he had been in months, talking about the command for 15 minutes with the enthusiasm of someone who had just arrived somewhere he deserved to be. At no point did he mention that he had known about the assignment for weeks before I had left Coronado, that he could have told me, or that there was anything unusual about the sequence of events. I didn't ask. He took the billet I left. A year later, without a word until someone else mentioned it in a hallway. That is not a protocol. That is a choice. In 2020, I was selected for Rear Admiral, lower half, flag rank, 1 star, 07. It was a milestone I had worked toward across 24 years and 2 combat deployments, and every room I had sat in that wasn't built for me. I called Del Rey. He picked up on the 3rd ring. There was a pause of approximately 2 seconds before he said, "Good for you," and asked which billet I was going to. The call ended 4 minutes later. I set the phone down on my desk and looked at it for a moment. I am trained to read the gap between what someone says and what they mean. I recognized the 2-second pause and the flat congratulations and the immediate pivot to logistics, and I chose, one more time, not to name what I was looking at. That was the last time I made that choice. I just didn't know it yet. In 2023, I was appointed Commander, Naval Special Warfare Group 2, Joint Expeditionary Base, Little Creek and Fort Story, Virginia. I read the command appointment letter alone in my office. The same desk, the same window, the same quiet building at the edge of the East Coast waterway. The quiet arrival of something I had earned entirely on my own. Not the fruit of proximity to someone else's influence. Not the outcome of borrowed frameworks or a name attached without credit to someone else's footnotes. Mine. All of it, fully and without asterisk, mine. On Thursday, October 9th, 2025, I flew to Naval Amphibious Base Coronado to personally deliver a classified briefing to SEAL Team 5. The mission cycle was sensitive enough that I had requested the briefing be kept off the formal schedule until the moment of delivery. My office transmitted the full visitor package through official channels the previous morning. My name, my photograph, my 2-star designation, my arrival time, and the standard advisory that the flag officer should be met at the flight line on arrival. It was a routine notification, identical in form to every other flag visit package sent by that command in the preceding 12 months. Unremarkable, complete. It contained everything the receiving command would need to know who was coming and prepare accordingly. What arrived at Team 5's officer in charge, after passing through Captain Marcus Del Rey's administrative staff at the Naval Special Warfare Center, was a single line. Flag officer visit per restricted schedule. OPSEC protocols apply. Name and bio not for distribution. My name stripped out. My photograph removed. My rank reduced to the vague and anonymous designation of flag. A category broad enough to mean almost nothing. Specific enough to make clear that everything was being withheld on purpose. The substitution was not automated. Someone made the change manually, at a specific terminal, on a specific account, at a specific time. I didn't know that yet when my C-12 touched down at 13:45 hours. I was in service khakis with my flight coat buttoned, 2 stars visible on the collar, name tape readable at ordinary conversation distance. Commander Sarah Voss, my senior intelligence aide, confirmed the briefing facility was prepped and the target package materials had arrived intact and in sequence. Captain Del Rey met me on the tarmac, professional, composed, 2 minutes of the practiced pleasantries that senior officers exchange when they are operating in shared space without being in each other's direct chain of command. He told me the team was ready. He did not mention the notification. I had no reason to ask. I thanked him and moved toward the briefing facility, deciding to take a brief, private call with Voss before going in, because a last-minute change to the target package needed verbal confirmation. I have walked behind that hangar probably 40 times over the course of my career at Coronado. I knew the space. I belonged in the space. The only thing that had changed since the last time I had walked, it was that someone had decided the space needed to be unaware I was coming. The call connected. Voss was mid-confirmation when Petty Officer First Class Caleb Burke rounded the corner. He was a SEAL Team 5 operator, 32 years old, returning from a smoke break. What he saw was me, alone in a restricted access lane in service khakis, with no photograph to compare against, no name to cross-reference, and no rank identified beyond whatever his uncalibrated read of the situation provided. He didn't ask for identification. He didn't call out a standard challenge or request. He moved toward me with the deliberate, unhurried pace of someone who had never had cause to question his right to move in any direction he chose, in any restricted space he chose to be in. He closed the distance between us. He pressed into my personal space in a way that used his height and his size, and the wall of the hangar as a coordinated arrangement. He leaned in. "You shouldn't be out here alone, sweetheart," he said. He laughed at the end of it, a short, genuine exhale of amusement that told me he found the situation entertaining. "Give me one good reason to let you go." I did not move. I did not raise my voice. I did not reach for my identification, which I was carrying and which would have ended the conversation in a different way. I looked at him, measured even, the way you look at a problem you've already solved before the conversation started, and I spoke with the same tone I use in classified briefing rooms when the audience includes 4-star principals. "Because in 10 minutes I'm briefing your entire team," I said, "and I already have your name, Petty Officer." He had been identified by name on the team radio channel 2 minutes earlier, when Voss's call was still connected to the net. A routine check-in, his name spoken clearly. The kind of incidental identification that happens constantly in operational environments where radio discipline is real, but not paranoid. He didn't know I had heard it. He didn't know much about me at all, which was precisely the condition someone had worked carefully to create. His expression moved through several states in rapid succession. Comprehension arrived last and settled badly. I stepped past him, continued toward the briefing facility, and did not look back. I have briefed rooms full of men who didn't believe I belonged at the front of them. I have learned to carry authority the way you carry a sidearm, not in your hand, but on your person. Present, accessible, never brandished unless the situation requires it, and even then, briefly. Burke understood in the next 10 minutes what he should have known before the hangar. He was looking at the most senior officer on the base. The room would make that clear before he found his place against the rear wall. I entered the briefing room at 1400 hours exactly. The room stood. Commander Owen Tate, Team 5's officer in charge, called it to attention. The 32 personnel of SEAL Team 5 had been told a flag officer was coming. Not who. Some of them read the stars on my collar first. Some read my name tape. All of them sat back down when directed and prepared to receive the briefing without further ceremony. Approximately 4 minutes after I began, Burke came in through the back door. He found a position against the rear wall and did not move from it. He was sweating through his uniform in a way that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. I delivered the full classified read-in, 41 minutes clean and precise, no note cards, the same composure I had carried from behind the hangar, and when it was over, the room stood again. Burke remained at the wall. When the room cleared, I said simply, "Petty Officer Burke, remain." He did. I retrieved a blank incident report form from my attaché, set it on the table in front of him, and placed a pen beside it. I told him he had one opportunity to write down exactly what had happened behind Hangar 3 before I wrote it myself. His account would exist in the same file as mine. He picked up the pen. He wrote without embellishment and without minimization, because there was nothing to minimize, and he understood that completely by then. I read the completed form. I signed the witness line. I told him that by 1800 hours, I would have submitted the form to the appropriate command authority. He said nothing. I walked out. I gave him a pen and a form and one chance. Not because I was being merciful, because I wanted his handwriting on the account of what he did. The most important lessons are the ones you write yourself. By 1800 hours, the incident report had been submitted. Burke had been removed from the Team 5 mission roster and reassigned to base pending the initiation of an Article 15 review. My plane lifted off at 1834 hours. I didn't brief my staff. I didn't mention it to Voss on the return flight. I looked out the window as the lights of the base receded below me. Coronado, the bay, the bridge, the Pacific dark beyond it. I thought about a phone call in 2020 with a 2-second pause in it. I thought about a footnote with no name. I thought about a notification that had arrived at a briefing room with my identity surgically removed. I didn't yet have all the documentation, but I knew some power doesn't need to be raised in volume, only in altitude. I flew back to Virginia that night knowing exactly where I stood and exactly where he had tried to put me and exactly what the difference had cost him. A week after the incident, Commander Voss ran a routine review of all pre-visit communications between my office and NAB Coronado. She brought the communications audit to my office on a Tuesday morning and set it on my desk without preamble, a printed document in 2 columns, the kind of clean visual record that makes a deliberate act look exactly like what it is. Once you have the side-by-side comparison in front of you and there's no longer any reason to look away from it. The left column showed what my office transmitted at 0900 hours on October 8th. The full visitor package. My name, my rank, Rear Admiral, lower half, my photograph, my arrival time, the advisory that I should be met at the flight line on arrival. Standard, complete. The format was identical to every other flag visitor notification sent by that command in the preceding 12 months. Nothing unusual, nothing obscured. It was the template used correctly, doing precisely what it was designed to do. The right column showed what arrived at Team 5's officer in charge at 14:30 hours the same day, a single line, flag officer visit per restricted schedule. OPSEC protocols apply. Name and bio not for distribution. No photograph. No rank beyond the catch-all designation of flag. My identity surgically removed before the notification reached the people I was walking in to brief. The substitution was documented in the system. It was not automated. Someone made it manually at a specific terminal registered to a specific command suite at a specific time of day. 29 years in naval intelligence. I know what a deliberate substitution looks like. I know what it's designed to do. Someone had taken my name and rank out of the notification before it reached the room I was walking into, which meant that anyone in that room who didn't already know who I was could construct their own category for me without correction. And one of them had. 40 feet behind a hangar, that construction had consequences. I read the audit twice. Then I said, "Thank you, Sarah. Close the door on your way out." That afternoon, I called Captain Lena Park into my office and told her to close the door behind her. I told her the full account, not the incident report version, the real one. What Burke said, the tone of it, the casual certainty, the way he positioned himself against the wall and toward me simultaneously, using space as a tool, the specific language, the word sweetheart, the laugh that followed it, and the demand for a reason to let me go. I told her how I answered and how he looked when I walked past him. Then I slid the communications audit across the desk. Park read it without speaking. When she finished, she didn't say, "How could he," or "I'm so sorry," or any of the things people say when they're managing someone else's pain from a safe distance. She said, "You already know what this is, ma'am." I looked at her for a moment. I said, "Yes." She said, "What do you need from me?" I told her I needed 24 hours to think. She nodded and left. Lena Park has been my deputy for 2 years. She is precise, direct, and constitutionally allergic to performing empathy she doesn't actually feel. When she said, "You already know what this is," she meant it as information, not comfort. It was the most useful thing anyone said to me that month, and possibly the most honest thing anyone said to me in the entire 6 months that followed. I sat alone in my office for the rest of the afternoon with the door closed. For the first time since October 9th, I allowed myself to be fully angry. Not the controlled, purposeful anger I had carried through the briefing room and the incident report session, the kind that makes you precise and clear and economical. The other kind, the kind that comes when you stop explaining away what someone did to you and start looking at it directly and without patience for your own generosity toward the person who did it. I had carried those teams through 2 combat deployments, their files, their patterns under pressure, their lives inside classified target packages that I assembled with the care of someone who understood exactly what the stakes were and exactly what happened when the intelligence product was wrong. I had sat in cells in Iraq that smelled like dust and generator fuel and made calls that determined whether operators came home, and those operators trusted those calls because I had done the work, always and without exception and without requiring credit for it in the moment. And still, 40 feet behind a hangar, in khakis with 2 stars on the collar, at the base I had commanded for 2 years, someone rounded a corner, saw me alone, and made a decision based on that single data point and nothing else. The line from there to here ran through Del Rey's office. I had followed it carefully enough by then to know exactly where it started and exactly how long it had been running. I pulled his career file that evening, fitness reports going back to our early years together. I found in the 2003 through 2005 cycle a fitness report he wrote for a junior officer that cited a collaborative analytical methodology as a key contributor to the officer's professional development. The methodology was mine. I had developed it during my first Iraq deployment in field conditions, through months of pattern recognition and hard iteration on a target assessment process that had never existed in the form I gave it before I built it. I recognized the language in Del Rey's report because it was my language, not similar language, not language developed in parallel. My language, appearing in a document he signed. I also found, further in the file, 2 fitness reports I had written for him during his time as my peer on the NSWC staff, both strong, both recommending him for increased responsibility, both accurate and fair and generous. I wrote 2 strong fitness reports for a man who was quietly removing my name from documents while I was across the country building the thing he kept borrowing from. The irony is almost too clean to be useful. Almost. That night I opened the JAG protocols for initiating a command investigation into administrative conduct and read them carefully from the beginning with a specific office address in mind. I did not submit anything that night. I closed the screen, gathered my things, and went home. The most important decisions are the ones you sleep on before you make. Not because you will change your mind, but because when someone challenges them later, you need to be able to say precisely, I was certain, I was deliberate, I was not reacting, I was deciding. The morning after I read the JAG protocols, I called my father. Not about the investigation. I didn't tell him about the investigation, not then. I called because I needed to hear his voice, and I had not called him in 3 weeks, which was too long. He answered on the second ring, the way he always does, with a short hello that manages to sound both unhurried and entirely present. We talked about the weather in Annapolis, which had been unseasonably cold. We talked about his neighbor's boat being pulled for the season. We talked about nothing consequential for 9 minutes, and then he said, "You sound like you're thinking about something." I said I was. He said, "Then think about it until you're done, and then do what you know you're going to do." That was the entirety of his advice. It was more than enough. I have a photograph of my father on the credenza in my office, not his commissioning portrait, not a formal Navy photograph. It's a snapshot from a summer afternoon when I was 12, and he is standing at the end of the Little Creek Pier in civilian clothes, looking out at the water. He doesn't know the picture was taken. There's nothing posed about it. He is just a man standing at the edge of something large and looking at it without flinching. I put the photograph there when I took command of NS G2 in 2023, and I looked at it on the morning of December 1st, 2025, when I submitted the investigation request, and I looked at it that evening too, when the referral had been routed and the record had begun, and I thought about a man who decided to stay and kept deciding every day for 24 years, and I understood, sitting in my chair in the quiet office with the lamp on and the hallway dark, that staying and deciding are not 2 different things. They are the same thing in 2 different tenses. In December of 2025, I formally submitted a request for a command investigation into the notification failure surrounding my October 9th visit to Navy Coronado. I routed it precisely and without announcement through the NSWG2 JAG office, with the communications audit attached and a clear scope of inquiry limited to the administrative deviation surrounding the visitor notification substitution. The scope was narrow by design. I was not asking for a broad character inquiry or a punitive proceeding at this stage. I was asking for a factual accounting. How the visitor notification was altered, who made the change, whether it was authorized under any applicable protocol, and what command climate factors produced the decision to make it. The JAG officer reviewed the documentation and confirmed the scope was clean and well-grounded. The referral went out by close of business. I returned to my office and resumed my afternoon brief schedule without mentioning the referral to my staff. I didn't ask for a punishment investigation. I asked for a factual one. I wanted the record to say what happened, not yet what someone decided to do about it, just what happened, who made the change, and what conditions had created the environment in which someone decided the change was acceptable. Accountability starts with the facts. Everything else follows from the facts, or it doesn't, but the facts are in the record regardless of what happens to the accountability. Within 4 days of the referral being routed, Captain Marcus Delray's number appeared on my secure line. I watched it ring, 4 complete rings, then go to voicemail. An hour later, it rang again. Then a third time that same evening. I forwarded all 3 calls to Voss with a note. Log and retain. Do not respond on my behalf. In 28 years of knowing Marcus Delray, he had never called me 3 times in one day. Not when I deployed to Iraq the first time. Not when I deployed the second time. Not when I made flag and called him myself. 3 calls in one day means exactly one thing. He knew the investigation had been initiated, and he wanted the conversation that happens before lawyers are formally involved and the record is no longer informal. I was not interested in that conversation. I was interested in the record. The formal Article 15 proceedings for Burke moved into their review phase that same week under the authority of the Anab Coronado commanding officer. I submitted a written statement in lieu of attending in person, a detailed account of what Burke said, where, in what sequence, in what tone. It described my response. It described the incident report session that followed. It did not characterize. It did not editorialize. It stated the facts in the order they occurred, with precision, because precision is what a legal proceeding requires, and precision is what I do. In the statement, I noted, Petty Officer Burke's behavior was not an aberration unique to one individual. It was the product of an environment that failed to prepare him for who he would encounter in this command. That failure has a specific address, and I have routed the appropriate inquiry to that address separately. I meant both sentences. I meant them together, as a single integrated observation about cause and effect. Then the pressure arrived. Voss received a call from a senior officer in the Ozenstwal's command chain, not identified by name in any document, not attributed in any record, suggesting that both matters might benefit from command-level resolution rather than formal proceedings. The implication was that a quiet administrative correction, combined with a direct conversation between me and Delray, could resolve the issues without generating the institutional visibility of a formal investigation and a simultaneous Article 15 proceeding. The suggestion was framed as practical and collegial. Voss relayed the message to me verbatim, without editorial. I drafted a 1-paragraph written response. Both matters are appropriately routed through the correct channels and will proceed as initiated. I signed it with my full rank and title and had it transmitted that same afternoon. Someone always wants to resolve these things quietly. Not because quiet resolution produces better outcomes for the institution, it doesn't, and the people proposing it generally understand that. But because quiet resolution is better for the people who created the conditions that produced the incident, and those people are generally better connected than the person who was most directly harmed. I had spent too many years inside quiet resolution. I understood precisely what it cost, not just to me personally, but to the next person who would walk into a space that the quiet resolution had left unchanged. I was done paying that cost. As December closed, Burke's Article 15 proceedings produced their first formal outcomes: reduction in pay grade, suspension of special duty assignment, eligibility pending a reinstatement review, reassignment to a non-operational administrative billet pending the completion of the NJP process. His SEAL qualification status was placed under formal review. Delray submitted a written explanation through his JAG representative, citing routine OPSEC protocols as the justification for the notification modification. The explanation arrived in my inbox within the week. I received a copy because I was the flag officer whose visit had been affected by the administrative change under review. I read the explanation once. 29 years in naval intelligence. I know every legitimate application of operational security protocol in the NAS visitor notification process. Know it from years of writing the protocols, implementing them, and reviewing the fitness reports of the officers responsible for executing them. What I found in that 3-paragraph explanation was not a legitimate application of any protocol I recognized. OPSEC protects missions. It protects the timing and nature and personnel of operational activities. It does not protect the identities of the flag officers briefing those activities from the people who are being briefed. That is not what it was designed for, and the person who wrote that explanation understood that before he wrote it. So did the person who directed the change that the explanation was written to justify. I placed the document in the file and moved to the next item on my desk. 3 missed calls from Del Rey's number, unlistened to, logged in Voss's call record, and the investigation file. Open on my desk, one more page turned. I had waited a long time to be precise about something I had been too generous about for too many years. The precision felt clean. It felt like the work I was trained to do, applied at last to the right target. I spent the final days of December in my office at Little Creek, working through the ordinary business of command, personnel reviews, readiness assessments, the annual cycle of evaluations and planning documents that constitute the administrative skeleton of a major command. I did it efficiently and without distraction. That was its own form of answer to the people who had hoped the quiet resolution conversation would find purchase. The work continued. The investigations continued alongside the work. Both were happening simultaneously, in their appropriate channels at their appropriate pace. That is how the system is supposed to function. The fact that it required a rear admiral to decline 3 phone calls and submit a formal investigation request to make it function that way was information I kept in a separate column, available for future reference. There is a version of leadership that requires you to perform composure for the people around you, to appear unbothered so that your staff doesn't spend energy managing your reaction instead of doing their jobs. I have done that version of leadership for most of my career. In December of 2025, I was not performing composure. I had it. The difference is small from the outside, but significant from the inside. One costs you something in the doing. The other costs you nothing, because it is simply who you are and what you have built. I had apparently, across the course of a long career, built something. I noticed this in December and filed it alongside the other things I was noticing that month, which was a substantial list. January of 2026 brought the investigating officer's formal report. The findings were specific and unambiguous about the facts if measured in their attribution of intent. The visitor package modification was a manual change made at 14:14 hours on October 8, 2025, by a member of Del Rey's administrative staff using an account registered to the NSA&W Center's command suite. The change was not documented in any authorization log, not supported by any standing OPSEC protocol applicable to flag visitor notifications, and not consistent with the format or content of any other flag visitor notification processed by that command in the preceding 12 months. The accountability finding read, Command Climate at Naval Special Warfare Center, NAB Coronado, failed to establish or enforce applicable visitor recognition standards. The investigating officer delivered the findings in a 20-minute session. I thanked him, collected the report, confirmed receipt. I did not comment beyond that. The finding was clean. Not complete, there was no paper trail attributing a direct instruction to Del Rey personally, no written order directing the change. But it named the command. In the Navy, a finding that names the command is a finding that names the commanding officer. He knew that. The people reviewing his personnel file knew that. The record knew that, and the record was now permanent and could not be retracted. Del Rey's written explanation arrived separately, routing through his JAG representative, 3 paragraphs citing routine operational security practices for flag visits, referencing the sensitivity of the Team 5 mission cycle, characterizing the notification modification as a good faith judgment call by his staff. He received a letter of instruction, a formal administrative document placed in his service record, short of a reprimand but a significant mark at his career stage, the kind that follows a file into every subsequent review board. Voss read the explanation alongside me without comment. Then she said, 15 years of flag visits to that command, and they never applied that protocol to anyone else. I closed the file. She was right. I had verified it. Not once in 15 years had the same notification modification been applied to any other flag visitor. That is not a protocol. That is a choice. The letter of instruction won't undo the choice. But it will follow him out the door as a choice that was documented and found. In the staff planning cycle that followed the LOI, Del Rey's command tour at the NSOSW Center was assessed as approaching completion, and his assignment was not extended, standard policy, consistently and uniformly applied. His retirement moved from informal projection to active planning. He would complete his final command tour and retire as Captain 06 after 32 years of service. He would not be selected for flag. His career, which had begun when he graduated from the Naval Academy in 1992, the same year my father retired, and continued through 2 decades of proximity to work that was not always fully or accurately attributed to me, would close at the same command he had entered a year after I left. I didn't ask for his retirement to be accelerated. I asked for a factual investigation into a documented administrative failure. The rest was arithmetic. The system, when forced to do its accounting precisely, is reasonably competent at arithmetic. I had been declining the Women in Special Operations Leadership Forum invitation since September of 2025. The invitation had been extended twice, and I had declined both times with language about scheduling. In January of 2026, I accepted. I did not decide it was the right moment because of what had happened in October. I decided it because I had been finding reasons not to show up. And I had been doing that long enough, and the reasons I had been finding were not actually about scheduling. The forum was held in Washington in February, a full auditorium, women at every grade, from ensign to rear admiral, every warfare community and support community represented. I spoke for 22 minutes. I did not mention Burke by name. I did not mention Del Rey. I did not discuss the investigation or the letter of instruction or the communications audit or any specific event from the preceding 4 months. I spoke about the accumulation. The way structural friction in male-dominated command environments is not one large incident that arrives clearly labeled and undeniable, but 20 years of small ones that each resolve quietly and leave no individual record large enough to challenge. The way institutional momentum shifts not through confrontation alone, but through presence, sustained, documented, continuing, and never withdrawn. I didn't get here by being louder, I told them. I got here by being present, even when the room didn't prepare a seat for me. Presence, over time, becomes something no one can retroactively exclude. Build that kind of presence, build it deliberately, and build it every day, and don't let anyone name it for you before you name it yourself. The room was very quiet for the entire 22 minutes, quieter than most rooms I have briefed. The silence of people listening to something they have been waiting to hear, said in plain language, was different from the silence of a briefing room waiting for the next slide. I noticed the difference. I let it be what it was. At the exit afterward, a young ensign stopped me. She was 22 years old, in her service dress uniform ironed so crisply, I could see she had done it herself that morning. She had the particular stillness of someone who has been working up to a moment and has arrived at it ahead of schedule. I didn't know someone like you existed in this community, she said. I looked at her for a moment. Now you do, I said. Tell the next one. I got in the car. On the drive back to the hotel, I asked Voss to pull her file. Her name was Daria Cole. She was an intelligence track ensign, class of 2025, assigned to a shore billet, pending her first sea duty rotation. She was exactly as sharp as she looked, and her file confirmed it, and I made a note on the back of my program from the forum and folded it into my jacket pocket to deal with in the morning. The forum was the first time since September that I stood in a room and spoke about the thing I had spent 30 years doing without framing it as a career summary or an operational briefing or a command report. I spoke about it as a life. That was different. It took 22 minutes in a room full of quiet women and one ensign at an exit for me to notice that the difference mattered, and that I had been withholding it from others and from myself for a very long time. I returned to Little Creek the morning after the forum and went straight to my desk. I pulled Daria Cole's file from the system and read it in full. She had graduated from the Naval Academy in 2025, a year ahead of the standard timeline she'd been on track for. She'd tested out of one full academic cycle in her sophomore year by submitting an independent research project on multi-source signal intelligence correlation that her faculty review board had evaluated at the graduate level. She had requested the intelligence track on her service preference form, had ranked Naval Special Warfare Intelligence billets first, and had been assigned to a fleet concentration point as her initial duty station. Her fitness reports from her academy years were clean and specific and written by people who had noticed the same things I noticed in the 2 paragraphs she had spoken to me at the exit. I sent a note through the appropriate channels with a request to ensure her file reached the reviewing officer for the next intelligence school selection cycle. I wrote the note in 2 sentences. Both sentences were precise. Then I moved to the next item on my desk. Some things you do because you remember what it was like to need them done for you, and someone either did or didn't, and you know exactly what the difference cost. I remembered. I did it. That was all. In March of 2026, Commander Owen Tate requested a meeting with me at Little Creek. He had been reassigned to an NSWG2 adjacent training coordination role as part of the broader command climate review that followed the investigation findings, a reassignment that removed him from direct operational command of Team 5 while the institutional assessment of command climate continued. He did not request the meeting through a personal email or an informal phone call. He submitted it formally through the NOS.EG2 administrative chain with a subject line that read, Command Climate Protocol Reform, Request for Review with RDML Quinn. He attached a 7-page typed memorandum with the request. I received it on a Tuesday morning. I read the memo before I accepted the meeting, marked 3 specific sections in the margin with a brief notation each, and confirmed Thursday. The way someone makes the first move tells you everything about whether they have done the internal work or just the external calculation. The external calculation produces a phone call or an email asking for a chance to talk. The internal work produces a 7-page memo submitted through official channels with the specifics already on the page before anyone has asked for them. Tate did the internal work. He attached his thinking before the meeting, let the thinking speak for itself before he had an opportunity to explain it in person, and did not ask me to tell him in advance whether it was sufficient. That is not a small distinction. I have seen enough of the alternative to know exactly how different it looks. He sat across the table from me in my conference room without support staff, without a JAG officer, without anyone else in the room to manage the conversation or soften its edges. He was measured and direct. He acknowledged that the command climate on Team 5 had not prepared Burke for the reality of who he would encounter on the base, and that as the senior officer responsible for the culture and standards of that team, the failure in that preparation was ultimately his. He said it without hedging and without appending qualifications about how difficult command culture is to manage or how much context would be needed to fully understand the situation. He said what he was responsible for. He described what he had done about it since October. Internal recognition and identification training for all team personnel, completed in November. A revised command climate assessment, shared with the full team roster, including a structured discussion of the October incident without naming Burke by name or Quinn by name, framed around the systemic question of how a command prepares its personnel to recognize authority they've never previously encountered. Updated standing orders requiring that any unidentified person in a restricted area be engaged with a formal identification request, not a physical confrontation, not an assumption, a request. He answered every question I put to him directly and without deflection. I'm not here to manage this situation, ma'am, he said. I'm here because the situation should not have existed, and I want to be clear about what I believe my responsibility in that is, and what I've done about it. I told him I had read his memo. I told him that 3 of his 6 protocol proposals were directly adoptable as in SADO G2 standing orders, and that I intended to submit them for Navy-wide best practices distribution. The remaining 3 required refinement before adoption, not because they were wrong in their intent, but because their drafting language needed to be precise enough to survive implementation at commands with different operational profiles. I told him I would have my staff work with his proposals on the refinement. I did not offer forgiveness. That wasn't what the conversation was, and both of us understood that without it needing to be said. I offered something more operational, a pathway for the work he had already done to travel farther than his team. I also told him, plainly, that what he chose to do with the failure said more than the failure itself. I said it because it was true, and because I wanted the record of that meeting to reflect it, which it would, because I intended to note it in the summary document I would write that afternoon. I've watched men come into accountability conversations and perform accountability the way you run a quarterly fire drill, procedural, choreographed, over, before anyone has to actually feel anything or change anything permanently. The performance has a recognizable shape. Tate's meeting did not have that shape. He had done the work before he walked in the door, without anyone directing him to start, without asking permission, and without waiting for the institutional process to tell him that something needed to change. That is the difference between accountability and the performance of accountability. I know the difference. It's not subtle. After Tate left, I called Park in from the outer office. I summarized the meeting, not the emotional content, just the operational content, what the proposals were, and what the adoption pathway looked like. Park read the memo herself, taking her time with it, and when she finished, she looked up and told me she was genuinely impressed with the specificity of the proposals. I said, "He came without a lawyer. That's something." She said, "That's the beginning of something." We sat with that for a moment. Then she asked about the NSWG2 Standing Orders Revision timeline, and we moved into the work. At the end of March, I signed the revised NSWG2 Visitor Recognition and Reporting Protocols into standing orders. The document, 2 pages of updated standards for the identification and formal notification of all flag visitors to NS.OG2 subordinate commands, went out to all subordinate commands under my authority that same day. I submitted it simultaneously to the NSWC Best Practices Clearinghouse for consideration in the Navy-wide distribution process. The covering memo named the primary author, Commander Owen Tate, NSWG2. My countersignature appeared below his. I made certain of the order, and I made certain the order was visible. His name is on it. That was deliberate and considered and not incidental. When someone does the right thing, the record should say so, clearly, with attribution, and without the kind of ambiguity that allows credit to drift toward the person with the more prominent signature. I have been on the receiving end of the opposite arrangement for most of my career. I know with precision what it costs. I know it in the specific currency of compound interest across time. On March 12th of that year, Raymond Quinn turned 76. I called him in the morning, before the brief cycle began, because I had learned a long time ago that the brief cycle will always find a reason to consume the entire day if you let it start before you have done the things that matter for other reasons. He answered on the second ring. He said he was fine, which he always says, and he sounded fine, which he does not always sound. We talked for 12 minutes. He asked how the command was going. I told him it was going well, which was accurate. He said, "You sound like yourself." I said I was. He said, "Good. That's the whole thing. Everything else is details." We said goodbye, and I hung up and sat in the quiet office for a moment before the morning brief began. Everything else is details. He had said some version of that to me throughout my entire career, in different words, in different contexts, on different phones from different locations. The first time I understood what he meant was in Iraq in 2003, standing in a forward operating base intelligence cell at 0230 hours with a target package update that needed a decision in the next 6 minutes. I was 28 years old. I made the decision. It was right. I understood that what he meant was, know who you are, and then everything else is a problem to be solved, not a reason to doubt the person solving it. I had been carrying that understanding for 22 years. In March of 2026, standing in my office with his voice still in my ear, I understood it for the second time in a completely different way. Both understandings were correct. That was, I thought, what a father gives you when he does it well. 6 months after the hangar, everything that needed to happen had happened. Burke was reassigned, the investigation was formally closed, its findings in the permanent record. Del Rey's retirement was moving through the administrative pipeline. Tate's protocols were in the distribution system and traveling. The architecture of accountability was complete, documented, solid. And yet I found myself sitting at my desk on a Wednesday morning in early April 2026, reading the morning intelligence summary, and noticing that something I expected to feel finished did not quite feel finished. Not the external events. Those were settled, each one resolved and filed. Something internal, something I couldn't yet name precisely but was beginning to understand, was the real accounting, not the one the Navy had processed, but the one I owed myself. The question of what all of it had cost, not in the currency of institutional outcomes, but in the subtler currency of what I had been carrying, and for how long, and what it would mean to finally set it down. The intelligence summary that Wednesday was routine. I read it efficiently, the way I have been reading intelligence summaries for 29 years, without losing a single morning to the habit. Midway through the second page, I noticed something. I was not carrying the weight I had been carrying since October. Not gone entirely, not yet, but lighter. The particular heaviness of someone holding a situation in sustained readiness, Alert for the next development, the next challenge, the next thing that required management. It had shifted. Without my noticing exactly when, I didn't stop to annotate the shift. I finished the brief. But I noticed it, the way you notice when a sound that has been continuous has stopped, and the room is quieter than you realized it had been for a long time. My father called on a Sunday afternoon in April, the way he does approximately every 2 weeks, in the late afternoon when the light in Annapolis has gone gold and he has finished whatever he was doing in the yard and come inside to sit at the kitchen table. He asked how things were. I told him, not everything, but the shape of it, that I had walked through something difficult over the preceding 6 months, that I had handled it through the proper channels in the correct sequence, and that something on the other side of it felt different than I had expected. Not triumphant, not resolved in the clean way resolutions feel in the versions of stories where things conclude properly, but quieter, more like clarity than victory. He listened without interrupting, which he is very good at, better than most people I know who have done 30 years of significant work. When I finished, there was a comfortable silence, the kind between two people who don't need to fill space with something that would be less accurate than silence, and then he said, "I never worried about you in those rooms, Erica. I worried about the rooms." Raymond Quinn spent 24 years in rooms that were not designed for someone like him either. He never said that directly. He never turned it into a speech or a lesson or a conversation that was clearly meant to transfer something. He simply kept coming home in the khakis and sitting at the table and answering questions about what the anchors meant, and over time, the answer accumulated into something I could finally read completely. In April of 2026, I sat in my office after hanging up the phone and understood that surviving inside a resistance system is its own form of leadership. Not the visible kind that gets commemorated, but the kind that accumulates into something undeniable over time. I had been practicing that form since I was 17 years old in the corridors of Bancroft Hall and didn't know it had a name. In April, I began to understand what I had built with it and that the building was not finished. Delray's retirement paperwork crossed my desk for administrative countersignature in April. I read it without annotation. He would retire as Captain 06 after 32 years of service. The document was procedural and complete and said nothing beyond dates and rank and entitlements. I signed where required and closed the file. I expected to feel something with a specific texture, triumph, or the particular relief of a long wait finally lifted, or some version of grief for the thing the friendship had been before I understood what it actually was. What I felt was quieter than any of those. Closer to reading the last page of a book I had understood completely 100 pages earlier. The ending arrived and confirmed what I already knew. It was not new information. That week, an email arrived from Ensign Daria Cole. 2 formal paragraphs. She had been selected for an advanced intelligence training school through a competitive process, and she wanted me to know. She thanked me for my words at the forum. She said she had passed the language along to 3 junior officers in her command, who she thought needed to hear it. She did not ask for anything further. I read it once, sat back in my chair, and thought about the ensign I had been at 22, arriving at the Little Creek Directorate with everything to prove, and no map for how to prove it in a system that was still deciding what to do with my presence. I thought about the specific care it had required to stay precise and to stay present through 20 years of rooms that required recalibration every time I entered them. Then I picked up my pen and started drafting a fitness report for Ensign Daria Cole, Spring Cycle, 2026. She said she told 3 people. I told one person, Lena Park, in a closed-door conversation in November, and that single conversation traveled to a JAG referral, a formal investigation, a protocol reform, and a Navy-wide circular. Things travel when you give them a clear direction and enough force. That is the mechanism. It has always been the mechanism. The question is only whether the person who starts it gets to see where it ends up. And the answer to that question is, sometimes, and only if you stay long enough to watch. That month, I walked to the Little Creek Pier after a long command day. I have done this since I arrived in 2023, a 10-minute ritual, the only time of day I am fully unhurried. I stood at the edge of the pier in the late evening with the water gray and flat and moving. The kind of water that looks still from a distance and isn't. I had been waiting, I understood, for something external to arrive and make the story feel complete. A moment, a sentence, an event that would close the account and release what was still being held. Standing at the pier in April, I understood for the first time that no such event was coming. Because the resolution I was waiting for was not external. It was a question I had been circling without quite asking. What does someone owe herself after 30 years of precision in service of a system that only partially saw her? What does collecting on that debt look like for someone who has spent a career on the giving side of that ledger? I stood with the question at the edge of the water and did not answer it immediately. I was, for the first time, almost ready to answer it honestly. I went back to the office the next morning and read the brief. I went back the morning after that and read the brief again. The ritual of 30 years of mornings doing the same precise work with full attention, that was one part of the answer. The other part was harder to name. It had something to do with the photograph of my father on the credenza, looking at the water without flinching, and something to do with an ensign at an exit, who had never seen a room built with her presence in its blueprint until she walked into mine. It had something to do with a protocol circular traveling through the fleet with the right name at the top of it. Collecting on it, I was beginning to understand, was not a moment. It was the accumulation of every morning I had decided to stay, finally understood as the valuable thing it had always been. It arrived the way earned things tend to arrive. Not announced, not with a soundtrack, not in a single moment large enough to be named while it is happening. In the last weeks of April and the first days of May 2026, I began to feel the specific lightness of someone who has done a hard thing correctly and come out the other side still intact, still in the work, still exactly where she is supposed to be, and no longer carrying the question of whether that is true. In early May, I received a call from the commander, Naval Special Warfare Command, a Vice Admiral, 09, my superior in the NAS-Zicin chain. He told me the NS Eastlands 2 Visitor Recognition Circular was being adopted for Navy-wide best practices distribution. He noted the clarity and practical specificity of the protocol, the straightforward applicability across command types and operational profiles. He did not mention October 9th. He did not need to. I thanked him and hung up. Tate's 6 proposals, refined over 2 months of staff work into 2 pages of clear, enforceable standards, were now traveling to every NSA command in the fleet, and from there into the broader distribution network that would carry them to commands beyond naval special warfare. The circular went out with Commander Owen Tate's name as primary author and my counter-signature below it. That is the record. That is what the next officer will find when she looks up the applicable standards for flag visitor notification. Not a story about what went wrong, but a document about what someone built in response, and whose name is on it and whose counter-signature confirms it. Someone did the work after the thing went wrong. That has always been the only answer. It has never been anything other than that. Later that month, Lena Park and I ate lunch in the NSWG2 mess hall. Nothing scheduled, a regular lunch, 40 minutes without an agenda, the kind that happens between people in the same command when neither of them has manufactured a reason to avoid it. We did not discuss the investigation, or Burke, or Del Rey, or the circular, or the forum, or any part of the preceding 7 months. Park's daughter's soccer team had made the regional semifinals. Park was cautiously optimistic about their chances in the way she is cautiously optimistic about most things, which means she thought they would probably win, but was unwilling to say so in any environment where the statement could later be held against her. I asked about the goalkeeper, whom I remembered from a previous conversation as a recurring source of Park's tempered enthusiasm. Park told me the goalkeeper remained inconsistent, but had shown meaningful improvement in the second half of the season. We discussed the goalkeeper's development arc for several minutes with genuine and unironic investment in the outcome. I laughed at something Park said. Genuinely, easily the kind of laugh that comes out before you've decided whether you want it to. It was a small laugh, not particularly notable from the outside. A brief and unremarkable sound in a mess hall that is accustomed to unremarkable sounds. I realized after the fact that it was the first unguarded laugh I'd had since September of 2025. 7 months. I noted it the way I note entries in the intelligence summary. As data, as evidence of a condition that has changed, and the change appears to be holding. It's a small thing to measure. It is the most accurate thing I know how to measure. I wrote Ensign Daria Cole's fitness report for the spring cycle in early May. I did not make it about myself. I did not reference the forum or the conversation at the exit, or the 2-sentence note I had sent to ensure her file reached the right reviewing officer at the right time. I wrote about her analytical capacity, her demonstrated intellectual initiative, her specific decision to pass learning to 3 junior colleagues before anyone asked her to, a behavior I identified in the report as a marker of leadership potential in its earliest form, observable before the institutional structures that typically identify leadership potential have had time to deploy. I wrote carefully with the full weight of understanding what a fitness report does across a career over time. I know what it means to have someone write the right words at the right time, to have someone with a significant signature put their authority behind yours before the world has had time to confirm that you deserve it. I have had reports written for me that were accurate, and some that were generous, and some that were technically correct and carefully calibrated to stop just short of clearing the bar I was approaching. I know the difference between a fitness report written to describe someone and one written to advance her. I wrote Daria Cole a report to advance her. It was the easiest thing I had done all year, which is to say it required no calculation whatsoever, only the clear recognition that the investment was obvious, and the moment for making it was exactly right. The formal closure notification on Burke's Article 15 proceedings arrived in my inbox as a routine administrative item late in the month. His non-judicial punishment had been fully executed. His reassignment to a non-combat administrative billet on the East Coast was complete. His SEAL qualification status remained under review pending the reinstatement timeline established by the NJP finding. I read the notification, marked it received, filed it in the appropriate folder, and moved to the next item. I do not think about Caleb Burke often, not because what he did was small, it was not, but because his decision was, in the end, the least complicated element of everything that followed from it. He acted on what he had been allowed to believe, inside a climate that had failed to prepare him for who he would encounter. The conditions that produced that belief, the environment that made me, even in 2-star khakis, an unrecognizable presence in a space I had every right to occupy, were what mattered. Those conditions are what changed. Burke is a data point inside a larger finding. The finding is what carries forward. That is how these things work, and that is the only way they work, and understanding that clearly is its own form of answer to the question I had been standing at the pier trying to ask. On a morning in early May 2026, I sat at my desk in the NS Dabuza G2 headquarters at Little Creek with the next intelligence brief in front of me, unread and waiting in the quiet of the morning before the day had started in earnest. I looked out the window at the base, the water tower, the training buildings, the edge of the waterway that catches the morning light and makes it visible from inside the office if you look at the right angle at the right time of day. I thought about myself at 9 years old, standing in a doorway watching my father cross the threshold from the Navy back to the rest of his life, and asking him what the anchors meant. I thought about the ensign I had been at 22, arriving at my first fleet billet with everything to give and nothing yet in the record to show for it, in a system that was still deciding what to do with my presence. I thought about every Iraq tour, every target package, every fitness report written for someone who didn't return the care. Every 2-second pause on a phone call that told me exactly what I was looking at before I was ready to name it. Every deliberate omission that had to accumulate before the condition behind the hangar could be manufactured and put in place. All of it necessary, all of it forming something. Then I looked at the brief, I picked it up, I read it. I am still exactly where I am supposed to be. I didn't leave that hangar because I outranked him. I left because I knew exactly who I was, and he was going to have to figure out who he was on his own time, without my help and without my patience. That is not a lesson you teach someone in a confrontation. That is a lesson you become over the course of a career spent deciding every single morning to stay. If you have ever stood somewhere, a hangar, a boardroom, a classroom, a kitchen table, and felt the specific pressure of someone waiting for you to prove you belong there, you don't owe them the proof. The proof is that you're standing there. You have already been doing the work. The only thing left is to let yourself know it. I walked away from this knowing one thing. You don't have to prove your worth to people committed to overlooking it. Have you ever had to reclaim your voice after staying quiet too long? Have you ever had to walk away from people who refuse to respect you? Share your story in the comments. And if this reminded you of your own fight to stand tall, hit like, subscribe, and stay with me for more true stories about self-respect, accountability, and starting over stronger.